Stranded beyond law. True stories from the world's most isolated islands. When people imagine being stranded on an island, they usually picture adventure, endurance, and the triumph of the human spirit. But history tells a far more disturbing story. Again and again, when ships disappear and the world beyond the horizon falls silent, isolation does not merely test the body, it dismantles the rules that hold societies together. What remains is not nature versus humanity, but humanity against itself. This video is not about survival skills or heroic escapes. It is about what happens when law evaporates, when authority becomes negotiable, and when morality is no longer enforced by witnesses. On remote islands across 3 centuries, men and women were left alone with hunger, fear, power, and each other. Some built cooperation from nothing, others constructed kingdoms of terror. The difference was never the island, it was the people. These are real stories, drawn from shipwrecks, abandoned colonies, and forgotten outposts of empire. Taken together, they form a single question that refuses to fade. When civilization disappears, what truly governs human behavior, and how thin is the line that keeps us human? The Blood Kingdom of Abrolhos. The tragedy of the Batavia 1629. The story of the Dutch ship Batavia, flagship of the Dutch East India Company, stands as one of the darkest chapters in the history of seafaring. This is not merely the account of a shipwreck, it is a detailed chronicle of how a psychopathic personality can exploit catastrophe to construct a miniature totalitarian state. On June 4, 1629, the Batavia, sailing at full speed, struck a reef at dawn near the Houtman Abrolhos archipelago, roughly 60 kilometers off the coast of Western Australia. Of the 322 people on board, around 40 drowned almost immediately, attempting to swim to scattered fragments of land, barren limestone, and coral islets. Commander Francisco Pelsaert and skipper Ian Jacobs soon realized that the islands offered neither fresh water nor sufficient food. They made a controversial decision. Taking 48 officers and sailors, they abandoned the survivors in an open boat, promising to reach Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, and return with help. The remaining 180 to 200 people on Beacon Island, later known as the Batavia's Graveyard, fell under the control of Jeronimus Cornelis, a merchant's assistant and follower of heretical beliefs that rejected the very concept of sin. Cornelis understood that Pelsaert's return would mean his execution for a mutiny already planned aboard the ship. His solution was to build a kingdom of his own. The strategy was brutally simple: eliminate useless mouths and potential rivals in order to preserve resources for himself and a loyal band of enforcers. Cornelis established a so-called council, quickly filling it with his supporters. He disarmed the survivors, confiscated boats, and initiated a campaign of systematic terror. Murders were carried out at night. People were drowned in lagoons, stabbed in their sleep, or beaten to death under the pretext of maintaining discipline. One of the most harrowing episodes involved Lucretia van der Meulen, a noble passenger forced to become Cornelis' concubine after his men murdered her entire family. The sole obstacle to Cornelis' rule was a group of soldiers led by Wiebe Hayes. Cornelis sent them to nearby Wallaby Island, believing it to be waterless and expecting them to die. Instead, the soldiers discovered fresh water and food wallaby kangaroos and learned of the massacres on Beacon Island from a handful of escapees. Using limestone blocks, Hayes and his men constructed a primitive fort, armed only with improvised weapons. They repelled to attacks by Cornelis' professional killers. When Pelsaert returned 3 months later, aboard the rescue ship Sardam, Wiebe Hayes reached him first and warned of the mutiny. Justice was swift. Cornelis had his hands severed, and was then hanged alongside his closest accomplices, directly on the islands where the crimes had taken place. The tragedy of the Batavia left behind more than bodies. It left mass graves, and the ruins of the first European-built structure in Australia, the fort of Wiebe Hayes, a silent monument to how thin the boundary can be between civilization and absolute brutality. Winter hell on Boon Island. The Nottingham Galley 1710. Unlike the political madness of the Batavia, the story of the British vessel Nottingham Galley is a battle for physical survival, in extreme cold and an ethical dilemma that would ignite public debate in 18th century London. On December 11, 1710, the merchant ship, commanded by John Deane, and carrying a cargo of cheese and ship's rope, was wrecked on Boon Island, a tiny rocky outcrop off the coast of what is now the U.S. state of Maine. Boon Island measures only 90 by 210 meters. It is almost completely barren and fully exposed to the icy winds of the Atlantic. All 14 crew members managed to reach the rocks alive, but nearly all their possessions sank with the ship, save for a few wheels of cheese. From the very beginning, tension erupted between Captain Deane and his first mate, Christopher Langman. Langman accused the captain of deliberately wrecking the ship to collect insurance money, in a setting where the only shelter was a tent stitched from torn sails, and the daily ration consisted of seaweed and 3 mussels per person. Suspicion quickly hardened into open hostility. 2 weeks after the wreck, the ship's carpenter died. By that point, the survivors were suffering from severe frostbite, many of their feet already blackening with gangrene. Faced with starvation, they made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. Captain Deane, who had once worked as a butcher, dismembered the carpenter's body so the others could survive. This act allowed 10 men to endure until January 4, 1711, when they were finally spotted from the mainland and rescued. The tragedy of the Nottingham Galley left a lasting mark. 4 decades afterward, local fishermen regularly left barrels of provisions on Boon Island for future shipwreck victims, a practice that continued until the island's first lighthouse was constructed in 1799. What remained was not only a warning etched into the rocks, but a question that still endures. Where does survival end, and something darker begin? Mutiny on Wager Island. The collapse of maritime law 1741. The wreck of HMS Wager off the Patagonian coast of Chile offers a stark case study in how military discipline disintegrates under hunger and under the realization that the law no longer applies on an uninhabited shore. The ship was part of the squadron commanded by Commodore George Ensign, dispatched to intercept Spanish treasure galleons. After a brutal passage down Cape Horn, the vessel, already weakened by rot and scurvy, was driven ashore on a deserted island in May 1741. Of the 250 men aboard, only 145 made it to land alive. Captain David Cheap, a man known for rigid adherence to orders, believed his authority extended onto land, yet under British law at the time, a sailor's pay ceased the moment a ship was lost, a detail many interpreted as the end of any obligation to obey. The group fractured almost immediately. Cheap insisted on marching north to attack the Spanish port of Valdivia, hoping to complete a secret mission for the crown. The ship's gunner, John Bulkeley, along with the majority of the crew, viewed this plan as suicidal, and instead sought to return south through the Strait of Magellan. The breaking point came when Captain Cheap, in a fit of paranoia and rage, shot and killed midshipman Henry Cozens. This act of tyranny cost him his last supporters. Bulkeley arrested Cheap for murder and departed the island aboard a rebuilt barge named Speedwell, carrying 81 men. Bulkeley's group undertook an extraordinary 3,000-mile voyage to Brazil, but only 33 survived the journey. Cheap and a small band of loyalists, including the young midshipman John Byron, later the grandfather of the poet, remained behind, stranded without supplies. Their survival depended on the indigenous Chono people. A leader named Martin Oliter agreed to guide the English through the hidden channels and routes of Patagonia to Spanish settlements in exchange for their barge. When both groups eventually returned to England years later, the resulting tribunal became a public sensation. The Admiralty, eager to avoid acknowledging that British sailors could become mutineers, murderers, or cannibals, issued remarkably lenient judgments, effectively burying the case. The wreck of the Wager revealed an uncomfortable truth. When the ship is gone, The sea law goes with it, and authority survives only as long as people choose to believe in it. 15 years on an island of sand. The slaves of Tromelin Island, 1761 to 1776. The tragedy of the French ship Atoll stands as one of the most powerful testimonies to human resilience and to the capacity for social organization even in the aftermath of profound betrayal. In 1761, the vessel was illegally transporting approximately 160 enslaved people from Madagascar to Mauritius. Due to a navigational error by Captain Jean de Lafargue, the ship ran aground on the reefs of Tromelin Island, then known as the Island of Sand. Around 60 Malagasy survivors and nearly the entire French crew made it ashore. What they found was a flat sandbank barely 1 square kilometer in size, without shade, without fresh water, and fully exposed to the elements. Using the wreckage of the ship, the French crew constructed a new vessel and departed after 2 months, promising to return. They never did. The governor of Mauritius refused to allocate a ship for the rescue of the enslaved. The Malagasy were abandoned for 15 years. Archaeological excavations led by Max Gouraut between 2006 and 2013 revealed an extraordinary reality. Rather than building the reed huts familiar from their homeland, the survivors constructed solid structures from coral blocks and sandstone, with walls up to 1.5 meters thick, engineered to withstand cyclones. They established a forge. They kept a fire burning continuously for 15 years. They fashioned copper cookware, jewelry, and tools from the remnants of the wreck. Analysis of more than 18,000 animal bones showed that survival depended largely on seabirds, primarily terns and sea turtles. Cultural taboos were set aside in favor of life itself. In 1776, the frigate La Dauphine, commanded by Ensign Jacques de Tromelin, finally rescued the last survivors, 7 women, and an 8-month-old boy. All the men had died or disappeared, many lost during desperate attempts to escape on makeshift rafts. This episode became a symbol in the struggle to abolish slavery. It revealed a devastating irony. Those dismissed as savages demonstrated greater humanity, discipline, and collective intelligence than the so-called civilized men who abandoned them. A social experiment in the Subantarctic. Grafton vs. Invercauld, 1864. In 1864, 2 shipwrecks occurred at opposite ends of the uninhabited Auckland Islands, south of New Zealand. The events that followed are often cited in management theory as a classic demonstration of how leadership shapes survival outcomes under identical conditions. The Grafton group consisted of 5 men, including Captain Thomas Musgrave and Francois Raynal. The Invercauld group numbered 19, under the command of Captain George Dalgarno. Both groups faced the same brutal environment, nearly 300 days of rain per year, constant cold, and chronic food scarcity. Captain Musgrave established a democratic system of governance, where key decisions were made by vote. The group constructed a proper dwelling, complete with windows and furniture. They organized a school to keep skills sharp and minds engaged. They even produced a handwritten newspaper to sustain morale. Raynal, drawing on his engineering background, built a forge and fabricated the tools required to repair a boat. After 20 months, all 5 men successfully left the island alive. On the opposite side of the island, chaos took hold. Captain Dalgarno abandoned leadership altogether, and the Invercauld group fractured into self-interested factions. Despite their numerical advantage, they failed to organize collective hunting or build adequate shelter. One by one, men died from starvation and disease while just 20 miles away. The Grafton crew lived in relative stability. In the end, only 3 of the 19 Invercauld sailors survived. Their rescue came not through planning or cooperation, but by chance by a passing vessel. The lesson is stark. Under the same sky, on the same island, survival was not determined by strength or numbers, but by leadership, structure, and the decision to act as a society rather than a crowd. Arctic Agony. The Franklin Expedition 1845 to 1848. The tragedy of Sir John Franklin and his 128 men remains the largest and most haunting disaster in the history of Arctic exploration. It is a story of how the most advanced technologies of the age, steam engines and preserved food, proved powerless in the face of nature, miscalculation, and human limits. The ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror became trapped in the ice near King William Island in September 1846. After Franklin's death in June 1847, command passed to Francis Crozier. By April 1848, with food supplies exhausted and the ships still locked in ice, 105 surviving crewmen abandoned the vessels and attempted to march south on foot toward the Canadian mainland. Modern forensic analysis of remains recovered on King William Island has revealed deeply unsettling details. POORLY soldered food cans caused chronic lead poisoning, impairing cognition, judgment, and physical strength. Traditional Royal Navy food preservation methods proved incapable of preventing severe vitamin deficiencies over a 3-year period. Examination of skeletal remains revealed cut marks consistent with dismemberment, indicating that during the final phase of retreat, sailors consumed the bodies of their dead companions. Even more telling were bones deliberately fractured to extract marrow, the so-called terminal stage of cannibalism. The Franklin disaster shattered the Victorian myth of the invincible British sailor. It forced the Admiralty to confront an uncomfortable truth. Arctic survival depended less on industrial confidence and more on adaptation, humility, and knowledge long held by the Inuit, knowledge that had been ignored to fatal effect. 18 Years of Solitude. Juana Maria 1835 to 1853. The case of Juana Maria, known to history as the Lone Woman of San Nicolas Island, stands as a singular study of the human mind's capacity to adapt to absolute social isolation. In 1835, the Mexican authorities ordered the relocation of the Nicoyo people to the mainland, ostensibly for their protection. 4 reasons that remain unclear: possibly a sudden storm, or the loss of a child on shore. A young woman was left behind. She remained alone on the island for 18 years, without human contact of any kind. During that time, Juana Maria built shelter from whale ribs, sewed clothing from cormorant skins using bone needles, and hunted seals for food. She sustained herself entirely through knowledge inherited from her culture, reshaping survival into a solitary routine that endured for nearly 2 decades. When she was discovered in 1853 by hunters led by George Lideva, she was reported to be in good physical health and, according to witnesses, constantly smiling. Yet rescue proved more dangerous than isolation. In Santa Barbara, she found no one who could understand her language. Her people had vanished. The abrupt change in diet, from 18 years of seal meat and fat to vegetables and flour, triggered severe dysentery. Juana Maria died just 7 weeks after being brought back to society. Her story endures as a quiet indictment of displacement and a lasting symbol of the bond between humans and their land. It reminds us that survival is not only biological, but cultural, and that identity, once severed from its environment, can be as fragile as the body itself. The Disappearance on the Flannan Isles, 1900. The tragedy on Eilean Mister is a classic example of an event labeled unexplained, one that for decades fueled legends of sea monsters and the paranormal. Yet the scientific explanation is far more ordinary, and no less tragic for it. On December 15, 1900, the merchant vessel Arcta passed the Flannan Isles lighthouse and observed that its light was extinguished. Due to severe weather, the relief vessel Hesperus was unable to reach the island until December 26. When it finally arrived, the island was deserted. The 3 lighthouse keepers, James Decat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, had vanished without a trace. Inside the lighthouse, everything was in perfect order. The lamp wicks had been trimmed, dishes washed, and logbook entries continued up to midday on December 15th. There were no signs of struggle, but on the western side of the island, investigators found evidence of immense wave impact, more than 30 meters above sea level. Twisted railings torn away, a concrete foundation for the supply railway ripped apart, a massive boulder displaced from its resting place. The most probable scenario is stark. Two of the keepers were attempting to secure equipment during a sudden storm surge, what modern oceanography would describe as rogue waves. The third, seeing the danger from inside the lighthouse, rushed out to help without donning storm gear, which remained inside. All three were swept into the sea. The incident on the Flannan Isles endures not because it is mysterious, but because it is brutally clear. It is a reminder of how small human order is. Logs, routines, rules, when confronted by the raw, indifferent force of the ocean. King Victoriano and the Clipperton Catastrophe, 1906 to 1917. The history of the Mexican colony on Clipperton Island is a chilling illustration of how isolation can transform an ordinary man into a sadistic tyrant. In 1906, Mexico established a small garrison on the remote atoll to assert territorial claims. When the Mexican Revolution erupted in 1910, supply ships ceased to arrive. By 1914, the colony, numbering just 26 people, was slowly dying from scurvy and starvation. Captain Ramnarno and the last 4 able-bodied men drowned while attempting to reach the Mexican mainland in a deteriorating boat. The only adult man left on the island was the black lighthouse keeper Victoriano Alvarez. Declaring himself king, he seized all remaining weapons and ruled the island through terror. For 3 years, he subjected the surviving women and children to systematic rape, torture, and murder, unchecked, absolute violence in total isolation. His reign ended on July 18, 1917. Alicia Arnaud, the captain's widow, and Tirsa Rendon lured Alvarez into a trap and killed him with a hammer. Just hours later, by pure coincidence, the American naval vessel USS Yorktown approached the island. 11 survivors were rescued, 3 women, and 8 children. The Clipperton Catastrophe stands as one of the most disturbing case studies in human behavior under isolation. It shows how the absence of law, oversight, and escape allowed power to decay into pure brutality, and how survival depended not on rescue, but on resistance. Anatahan, the island of the Queen Bee, 1944 to 1951. The story of Japanese soldiers on the island of Anatahan after the Second World War is a real-life version of Lord of the Flies, complicated and ultimately driven by sexual rivalry. In 1944, 31 Japanese sailors and soldiers were stranded on Anatahan. The island was already inhabited by a plantation manager and his wife, Kazuko Higa. After the manager's death, widely believed to have been a murder, Kazuko became the only woman among more than 30 men. For 7 years, the island descended into intrigue and violence. 11 men died, their deaths directly linked to competition for Kazuko's favor, or to struggles over pistols recovered from a crashed American aircraft. Authority shifted repeatedly, alliances formed and collapsed. Survival became inseparable from desire and access to weapons. By 1950, the remaining men concluded that the only way to end the bloodshed was to kill Kazuko herself. Learning of the plan, she fled into the jungle and was later rescued by an American vessel. The men surrendered only a year later, still refusing to believe that Japan had lost the war. Anatahan stands as a brutal case study in human behavior under total isolation. A closed system where biological impulses overwhelmed discipline, ideology, and military hierarchy, until social order collapsed entirely, leaving instinct as the final governing force. The Curse of Palmyra Atoll, 1974. The case of Palmyra Atoll is a rare example of how an uninhabited island became the stage for a carefully planned double murder, driven not by madness or survival, but by envy of another couple's resources. In 1974, two couples arrived on the atoll. Malcolm Graham and Eleanor Graham sailed in aboard the well-equipped yacht Sea Wind. The other pair, Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns, arrived on the partially sunken sloop Iola. Walker, a former convict evading authorities, quickly exhausted his limited food supplies and began to resent the Grahams, who possessed provisions sufficient for 4 years of isolation. By late August, the Grahams had vanished without a trace. Walker and Stearns soon appeared in Honolulu aboard the Sea Wind, claiming that the couple had drowned at sea. For 7 years, the story held. The truth emerged only when visiting sailors discovered an aluminum container, washed ashore on Palmyra after a storm. Inside was the charred skull of Eleanor Graham. Forensic analysis revealed that she had been murdered, and that her body had later been burned in an attempt to destroy the evidence. Using a welding torch, Walker was eventually convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The Palmyra case became a lasting reminder that so-called paradise offers no protection from human greed, and that isolation does not always produce madness. Sometimes, it simply removes witnesses. These stories aren't linked by place or time. They're linked by one thing only. They really happened. Shipwrecks, abandoned islands, forgotten colonies. Moments where ordinary people were pushed into extraordinary circumstances. And history quietly recorded what followed. If you're drawn to real stories from the edges of the world, places where survival, work, power, and chance collide, consider subscribing. This channel is about hidden histories, extreme environments, and human lives lived far from comfort or control. And I'm curious what you think. Which story stayed with you the most, and why? Let me know in the comments.